Hey, this is Cassandra at K's Gem Creations here with the tutorial. I'm going to be making a pendant with two stones here. I have a piece of azurite malachite and a Larimar stone. So for tools, I'm going to need a ruler. I've got a pair of nylon pliers, a pair of chain nose pliers, a pair of bent nose pliers. I have a pair of flesh cutters, a pair of round nose pliers, and a pair of tweezer nose pliers. And for the materials, I'm going to be using some 20 gauge square copper wire from Rio Grande and some 22 gauge half round copper wire, also from Rio Grande. So to start out this pendant, I'm going to need some extra long wire because this pendant is going to be quite tall. So I'm going to measure out 4 pieces of square copper wire at 16 inches each. And I'll just speed through this part. And once I've got 4 pieces cut, I'm going to take a little piece of half round copper wire here, about 6 inches or so, and I'm going to use that to wind around all 4 pieces of this square copper wire, and this is what's going to form the foundation or the bottom of my pendant. So about halfway down the lengths of those square copper wires, so 8 inches, I'm going to apply this half round wire with the flat side down, and then rotate it around those 4 base wires until I've got, a good little coil to set up the foundation of this pendant. And once I've got a band of half round wires about the length that I want it, maybe half an inch or 3/4 of an inch, I'll go ahead and cut off those excess pieces of wire. And this is what I'm going to call the inside of my frame. So each cut wire is going to be on the inside, and once I fold it around the stone, those cut ends will be inaccessible from the outside of the pendant. So I'm just going to double check and make sure that that little band is at exactly 8 inches. And then I'm going to use my nylon pliers to compress everything down and make sure it's nice and tight and secure. And then I'm just going to use my hands to start curving that wire into a U shape, and this is where I'm going to settle the larger stone, that azurite malachite, down at the bottom. And then I can use my hands and form the frame around the stone and really mold it to the side of the stones till I get a cage that I like. So once I know where I want these initial bends to go, I'm just going to go in and further indent that wire just to make sure that they're all lined up evenly. And then I'm going to bind these 2 sides together. This is where I would normally start a bail, but in this case, I'm just going to hold these wires together because I'm going to pop the other stone on top of this one. For right now, kind of the same as all of my other pendants, I just want to hold everything together loosely while I work on trapping that stone in place. So I'm going to grab a piece of scrap wire from an old project and hold everything together loosely. So I'm going to line up all these wires so that there's 2 rows of 4 pretty neatly, and then use that scrap wire to just wrap around a few times to keep it all secured. So for this next part, I'm picking which side I want for the back. And then I'm going to use my round nose pliers to latch on to the very last of the 4 wires here. And then I'm going to twist that wire inward a little bit to form a little triangular prong. And I'm going to do that on each side of the pendant, and this is what's going to hold the cabochon in place at the back. So I'm gonna just take my time here and make sure I'm liking the symmetry. I'm also just gonna use my bent nose pliers here just to kind of line those wires back up at the top a little bit. But that forms a really solid little back to this pendant, and then I can just pop the cabochon inside and work on fastening everything from the front next. So in order to do that, I now need to take the wires at the front of the pendant and pull them up over the face of the cabochon. Not way too much, but it does need to come up over the shoulder of the cabochon just to make sure that it's very secure and the stone can't pop out. I'll also grab the second wire closest to the front as well and pull that out a little bit too. This is just going to help further stabilize the stone inside that frame. And once I'm happy with how these wires are lined up, I'm going to go ahead and uh, fasten everything together permanently at the top using more half round wire. I'm just going to take some pliers. You can use nylon pliers. I'm just using my chain nose pliers here. And I'm going to exaggerate that bend a little bit more and also bring the two sides of the frame closer together, down closer to the stone. And this is where I'm going to use that half round wire to hold everything together. Because I'm using kind of a big stone, I don't want there to be too much space between the two cabs, so I want to really close up that gap near the top of this bottom stone before I get started. So I've got a piece of half round wire here that's about give or take 6 inches. It's definitely longer than it needs to be, but this is just so you've got something to hold on to. And I'm going to lay it with the flat side down around the very top of that cabochon and wrap it around about 3 times. So to secure that bottom tail, I'm going to pop it through the very little opening that I have between the frame and the cabochon down there. And I'm going to wrap it 2 times around the right side. And then I'll twist it with my pliers so that the round side is facing in the opposite direction. And then I will wrap this half round wire 2 times around the left side of the frame before I snip the end off. So once it's feeling nice and secure, I'll take my flush cutters and cut that wire off right where it exits the frame. Now I can remove that scrap piece of wire that was holding everything together because I'm going to start separating wires at this point so I can form the second part of my frame. The very last 2 wires at the back of the pendant, I'm going to pull backwards and out of the way because we're not going to use them to secure the second stone at the top. And then the remaining 6 wires that are still facing upwards, I'm going to split them off into their 2 sections, so 3 wires on either side. And once those are separated, I'm going to take the top tail piece of half round wire and I'm going to secure this down. Same way as I did at the bottom. I'm going to wrap it 2 times around the left side with the flat side facing down against those frame wires. And then I'm going to twist the wire so that the flat side is facing in the opposite direction. And I'll wrap it 2 times around the right side of the frame wires before I snip off the end so the cut side is inside the frame. I'm also just going to use some pliers here to make sure that everything is clamped really securely around those frame wires. So to start setting that second stone, I'm going to use my fingers again just to start bending the wire. I'm going to curve them a little bit inwards so that it's a bit easier to hold that stone in place while we get working on securing it. And then just bracing the stone with my fingers there instead of the flat surface. I'm just going to mold those wires around the stone just like I did at the bottom. And then same as before, I want to loosely fasten the two sides of this frame together while I work on trapping that stone in place. So I'm just going to use that same scrap piece of wire and hold everything together loosely. So on the back side of the pendant, I'll use those round nose pliers again to pull the very last wire inward to form that little triangular prong on the left and the right side, trying to make them as even as possible. Then I can pop that little Larimar right into place and use the front 2 wires to move over the face of the stone and secure it from the front. And for this part here, I don't want any sharp bends or anything, so I'm just going to use my fingers to slide that wire just over the face of the stone a little bit without creating any grooves or sharp angles there in the wire. I can then sort of straighten that wire back out a little bit using some pliers. Um, not to pull anything, but just to essentially straighten that wire back out. So just to get these back wires that I pulled aside out of the way, I'm going to straighten them out a little bit and then I'm going to pull them off to the side and then around the front of the pendant. And I'm going to use these wires to cover up that little joint that I made between the two stones. I'm going to wrap it 3 times in the middle here, and then I'm going to use those long ends to make a little design that kind of flows into the top of the azurite malachite. So once those 2 long wires are situated at the front again, I'm just going to use my thumb to hold them in place and just rotate this whole pendant to get a nice curl right at the top. I just want it to kind of overflow a little bit onto the very point of this cabochon. And then I'm going to take the outside wire and push it a little bit just to open up the space between those 2 wires. And I'll grab the inside wire and form another little curly Q, just smaller and offset a little bit to get kind of a cascading look. And once I'm happy with how those are lined up, I'm now just going to think about how I want to secure these down. So I'm going to separate them out, but first I'll just move everything off to the left-hand side, hold it down with my thumb, and then bend it in the opposite direction. I'm basically just making a bunch of S shapes so that I can make some curls and bind everything down with some half round wire. So the topmost wire I'm gonna curve in a counterclockwise direction, and the bottommost wire is gonna get curved downward in a clockwise direction. And it's where we've made these curves here that I'm going to use half round wire to attach these to the frame wires. I'm essentially sewing them down. And so with the flat side facing up this time, I'm going to tuck this half round wire underneath the frame wire and underneath that little curl that I made, wrap it around, and then I'm going to insert it underneath that frame wire again. And I'm going to do this a total of 3 times, so I've got a little band of 3. And once I've done that 3 times, I'm going to hang on to everything really tightly and use my pliers to tug on the ends of this half round wire to make sure everything is nice and tight. And then I'll take some flush cutters and snip off that excess wire right where it exits out of the frame wire there, so those cut sides can't be accessed. And then I'm just going to do the same thing with this bottom little S shape. I'll take another little piece of half round wire with the flat side facing up, tuck it underneath that frame wire and underneath the little loop, and then wrap it around or sew it into place here. And then I'm going to hold everything down really firmly with my thumb to make sure nothing gets too distorted, and tug pretty firmly on those ends to make sure it's nice and secure before I use my flush cutters to snip off those ends very close to the frame. So next I just want to trim these wires and curl them inwards in order to finish off the bottom of this pendant. So I'll snip roughly where I think I want a curl to start, and I'll use my round nose pliers to curve in the same clockwise direction that I started. And I've kind of decided here that I want that opening at the very center of this coil to be a little bit tighter, so I'll just use some tweezer nose pliers to close that up a little bit before I continue on with the round nose pliers, and just keep curling everything inward until I'm happy with the shape of this coil. And then with the upper one, I'm going to cut this one even shorter. I want an even smaller curl. And then I will just curl everything in a counterclockwise direction to kind of mirror what's going on with the bottom one. And I've decided here that this wire I left a little bit too long, so I'm going to snip off some of the excess before I continue curling inward, just to make sure I've got a nice tight little curl. So I can continue trimming and then tightening the inside of this curl a little bit if I want to make it tighter, which I do. And then I'm just going to use the butt end of one of my pliers here to push the inside of that curl downwards to make sure that there's no sharp edges or anything sticking out. So before I get started on my bale, I'm just kind of taking a look at everything, just kind of assessing it from all angles to make sure I'm liking how everything is flowing. At this point here, before things start getting permanently affixed in place, I just want to maybe readjust how these wires are sitting and make sure I like the way that they're, hugging that stone. And then I'm going to take my half round wire and use this to make my bale. So I'm going to lay it down at the top of my pendant here with the flat side down. And I'm so sorry you can't see this part. I'm going to move back into focus right away here. And once I've got a couple of rotations done, I'm going to take that tail end and I'm going to tuck it into place. I'm just going to pop it through the very little opening that I have between the stone and the top of the frame. And I'll do that a couple of times before I trim off the excess and clamp everything down to make sure it's nice and secure. So once that's feeling nice and tight and I've given it a good tug to make sure it's wedged in there, I'll use my flesh cutters just to trim it off right where it exits the frame. So I'm just going to take my nylon pliers to clamp that little band of half round wires down to make sure it's nice and secure. And then I'm going to isolate my very front two wires out of those top six. And those two wires are what's going to form my bale. So I'll isolate them and move them forward at an angle. And then I'll start wrapping my half round wire just around those bale wires. It's a bit of a struggle at this initial bend down here, but as soon as you move onto the flat wire of that bale, you can kind of just guide the wire with your dominant hand and then twist the whole pendant with your left hand, and that just lays the wire down in this nice coil around your bale. And I'm just going to do that and speed it up so you can see how this looks. So I'm happy with the length of this bale. It's about 3/4 of an inch. I don't want it to be too tall because this pendant is already pretty big. And then I'm going to take my nylon pliers to compress everything down and give a little bit of a bend to this wire right where that half round wire stops. So it just a really, really slight angle. And to form the bale, I'm just going to separate these wires. I'm going to move 3 to the right hand side and 1 to the left. And then I'll bend this bale wire so that it just folds itself in half between the two sides of the frame. And once I'm happy with the shape, I can take the last little bit of half round wire, that tail end there, and then wrap it around the two sides of the bale back down from where it originated before I tuck that into place. And then you've got a really nice secure bale. So I'm just going to move my bale wires out of the way and then tuck that half round wire in between that little gap up at the top and pull it really tight with some pliers to get it nice and secure before I snip it off. So my wires got a little bit moved around at this point, so I'm going to go ahead and readjust everything again. Just making sure that wire is sitting up high enough over the face of this cabochon to make sure that it's nice and secure before I get moving on the last portion of this pendant here. And again, I'm just using some pliers just to make sure everything's nice and straight and there's no kinks or weird curves in the lines of this wire here. So to make the top of this bail here, I'm first just going to grab it with my round nose pliers and kind of tweak it backwards just to make sure there's enough room for a chain to pop through. And then on the right hand side where I've got 3 wires, I'm going to grab the first one closest to the front of the pendant, and I'm just going to move it down over the face of the stone, hold it down with my finger, and then just rotate the whole pendant to form this curl. And then I'm going to grab the other 2 wires one at a time and curve them around that little curl that I made right up at the top. I'm also going to grab the wire from the left hand side and just add it to that bunch. And I'll hold everything in place with my thumb and forefinger there and wrap all 4 of those wires around the top of that pendant. And I don't want to cover up too much of this Larimar here, but I do want there to be a little bit of embellishment to kind of match what's going on the bottom. So I'm going to grab that very bottom of those 4 wires, twist everything around till I've formed a tiny, tiny little circle up at the top. And then I'm going to add that wire back into that grouping up there. And so still holding everything in place to make sure nothing gets too warped while I'm working. I'm going to move my bail wires out of the way in the opposite direction, and then I'm going to move those 4 wires that I wrapped around the pendant back towards the back again. And this is where I'm going to fasten them off and attach them to the inside of the frame. So I'm going to trim off those excess wires. So there's about 1/2 centimeter or so. And then I'm going to use my bent nose pliers to take those snipped ends and clamp them to the inside of the frame. There's like a tiny, tiny little space up at the top between the bail and the stone, and that's where I want those wires to get clamped onto. And this is how we're going to anchor those down. So I'm going to go nice and slow, just one at a time to make sure nothing gets too warped. And once they're all kind of guided in the right direction, I'll take another pass just to make sure everything is nice and secure. And then I can take that very last wire and I can move that to the back as well, just holding that little loop in place so it doesn't get too distorted. And then I'll trim off the excess of this wire and tuck it into place, same as the other 3. So I'll just snip it off and then use my bent nose pliers to tuck it into place into that tiny little void and clamp it down around the inside of the frame. And I'll just use those pliers here to start manipulating these embellishment wires around a little bit just to make sure I like the way everything is flowing. I'll also use some nylon pliers to do this as well, just to make sure that I'm not scratching this wire. I'm essentially just taking a look at everything from all angles and making sure I like how everything is flowing and making sure, it's nice and smooth. And then to take care of these bale wires, I'm just going to go ahead and trim off almost all of it. I'm giving myself about 1/2 centimeter of extra wire here, and I'm going to use my round nose pliers to twist them inward on themselves. And you can see it just starts making a little loop that tucks into the back of the frame, and I'll use the butt end of my pliers to push it in place. And so once those bale wires are tucked away and I've taken another pass at everything to make sure I like the flow, that's the pendant finished. So once all the cut ends are all tucked in, and I've taken a pass at everything with my nylon pliers to make sure I like the flow, the pendant is basically done. I hope you guys found this tutorial helpful and that you maybe give it a try. If you'd like to tag me in your finished work, I love to see what you guys are making. You can tag me at Kay's Gem Creations on Instagram and TikTok. And thanks so much for watching. I'll be back again soon with another tutorial.